Hello and welcome to the Plant Paradigm Podcast, where we have inspiring conversations with amazing people from all around the world and look for ways to create a clean, green and sustainable future for us, the planet and all beings. I'm your host, Tom Simak, a fellow plant eater who strives to optimize every living ecosystem. Passionate about looking after this beautiful floating rock we call home and all the lovely creatures that dwell among it. Friend and fellow podcaster with an amazing first name, Tommy Moore. Tommy hosts both Mind Body Plants and Mind Medicine, both of which centralise the theme of health and longevity. Today we'll be discussing the broad topic of plant power, looking at plant medicines and its role in our health as a society and how we can apply the knowledge from all these different studies in our everyday lives. I know this might seem like a super random, given that the discussions that we have here are usually due to health, climate change, solutions, mitigations, plant nutrition. In the broader field of health and the power of plants, I really thought a conversation regarding plant medicine is a much needed one, as I would consider it as a stage and a sector of alternative health. So amongst this whole conversation, I think you'll really enjoy Tommy's enthusiasm and well-versed knowledge. He's incredibly intelligent, and we take a lot of spins in this conversation, and his thought trains run like 2,000 kilometers an hour, and don't mind the different dialogues and monologues we follow randomly. I think it was a very wholesome conversation and I really enjoyed it, and I really hope you do too. So I hope you stay open to the conversation we'll be having and the thought trains that start running through your mind as we're talking about something that generally isn't talked about, or I guess is stigmatized. But without further ado, here is Tommy and I. Tommy, mate, it is about time we switch it up and you become the interviewee and I become the interviewer. You excited?
Very excited. It's the first in-person conversation that I've had in about 18 months. So I'm very excited for that.
I think I'm in a very similar boat. I think last time I recorded an in-person episode was with our mutual friend Carlo a while ago. And this is a really cool setup we have here. We actually got a camera on, like a proper camera. And I'm not just, say hi to the YouTube people. I'm not just recording a Zoom conversation. So thank goodness for no, like, you know how we were talking about Zoom interviews have that little cutoff? Like that little moment where, oh, this person's disappeared for like 3 minutes now. Like, are we still on?
I have no idea what you just said. I'm just going to assume.
Just they come back. You're like, yep, whatever you said. How you going? How you feeling?
I'm good, man. Yeah, I feel real refreshed. Just come back from a little trip. Went to Tassie and went to Queensland. Now I'm back, just settling back in. Got a few projects in the works for 2021.
What's in the works?
Well, giving Mind Body Plants a bit of a reform. So it's been a podcast for about coming up 18 months now, but I'm going to incorporate nutrition, exercise science, and offer more of a service. So far, it's just been educational content. Mm-hmm. So looking to branch out into the service side of things, which I'm super keen for.
I mean, that's really exciting. The episode you've done, and look, you've touched on nutrition as well. The last episode I listened of you had Nagra on, and that was a phenomenal episode. So I really looking forward to the revamp and seeing what episodes come out in the future for you. But look, where are we now? We're in this little HQ called Mind Medicine. What's this place all about?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So I guess part of what I do is I volunteer for a charity called Mind Medicine Australia. So Mind Medicine are primarily focused on the clinical application of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of mental ill health within Australia. And so we're a charity that's looking at expanding the treatment options available to medical practitioners and their patients through ethical and legal guidelines, clinical research, and also advocacy and education. So as part of my role within Mind Medicine is I'm the host of the Mind Medicine Australia podcast. So I get to talk to neuroscientists, neuropsychiatrists, and leaders in psychedelic assisted therapies from all over the world to explore this space. And so where we are now is Dimension 5 co-working space. So Tanya, who's the founder of Mind Medicine Australia, or co-founder, she has rents this space out to students and the likes, but also this is where all the people from mind medicine kind of collate together and work together. So that's the space in which we're in now, and I'm keen to talk about that.
I mean, you've interviewed neuroscientists and the likes of that kind of field. What's some of the most interesting things you've learned about the mind and the power that you have in there?
Yeah, it's
Look
an
at that
interesting
smile
one.
and that's oh, how can we culminate
You've
all this
set
knowledge?
me off.
Yeah.
I guess the first thing we need to do is disassociate mind and body and brain. I think the common programming that we're taught is that brain and mind are of the same. But I guess when we're exploring psychedelics, this kind of dismantles a little bit, because the body and mind, whilst they are very similar, and the brain, they do, I guess when we're talking about material science and we're looking at what is there based on, I guess, light reflecting on atoms and going into our eyes and what we can see, but that's only a very small amount of what there actually is. And so my interest in psychedelics came quite a few years ago when I guess the interesting thing about psychedelics is that it kind of encompasses a lot of different fields. So you've got people coming from philanthropy, anthropology, historians, scientists, neuroscientists, psychiatrists. So it actually encompasses quite a lot of professions, and I guess it's a multidisciplinary association, I guess we could call it. And so I guess I've always been someone who's into science and into the scientific method and trying to understand the world through science. And I came across psychedelics probably about 3 or 4 years ago, just looking through different research papers and exploring different things, and found some very interesting research. And your question was, what kind of sparked that? There was actually a study in 2006 from Roland Griffith's lab. So Roland Griffiths is one of the pioneers in this space. And he was looking at whether psilocybin, which is the active compound in magic mushrooms, combined with meditation, can, I guess, bring about profound mystical type experiences. And I was staring at the computer screen and thinking, what is a mystical spiritual experience doing in a scientific experiment? And so I investigated a little bit further and further and further, and then started to understand what psychedelics was all about and the history of psychedelics and what psychedelics have actually been used for millennia, which is spiritual healing. They've been used in pretty much every single culture throughout existence, other than the Inuits, which were right up the North Arctic, and because none of it grew there.
Even like Aboriginal Australians?
Yeah, so there's been links with the Dreamtime that they used certain psychedelics for that as like a transcendental type thing.
Awesome.
But that's also the, I guess, disappointing thing too, is that the Brits coming from England or wherever came into Australia, we've actually just kind of muted a lot of their history. And so a lot of that understanding has been lost through, I guess, the stolen generation and trying to incorporate them into our or Western way of life. And so, yeah, it's interesting how, because what I'd like in the future is that psychedelic therapy to be used in conjunction with traditional Indigenous traditions. So, yeah, I mean, it's an exciting time, that's for sure. But yeah.
Yeah, so just to set the record, I think something very important that you touched on is and we'll be talking a lot about psychedelics, and I guess while this is quite strange, it is still a lot of it plant medicines, and we're not talking about, although we have no judgments to recreational use, we're talking specifically about the use of it in, I'm guessing what you mean, in culture, in tradition, in healings, in different settings of that nature. But what's something, so when you say millennia, are we talking like Egyptian, like how far back?
As far as we can tell, as far as we can see back, it's been used in religious sacraments and traditions, as far as religion has been a thing. And it could even be the birth of religion in the first place, which is also very interesting.
I've heard of that. I saw like a little YouTube video. I didn't click on it to go down that rabbit hole, but that's an interesting thing we can maybe explore in the future. But I want to talk about plants for a second and started that route. When I say well, a lot of plant paradigms themed around the power of plants and what they can do. So when I say the power of plants, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Power of plants. I mean, first thing that comes to mind is plants. And of course, nutrition, being a whole food plant-based diet. Also, magic mushrooms being fungi, which isn't considered a plant.
No.
But it's interesting to see that fungi was our closest relative with plants, because we, both animals and plants, derived from fungus in the first place, which is super interesting. But yeah, when you say the power of plants, I think of a lot of different things. The first thing that comes to mind is probably nutrition. And then second thing, I probably think of fungi, although it's not a plant.
Well, when we're looking at health and nutrition, you've got quite an extensive background in that side of the world. What's the best piece of advice you've ever gotten in regards to health or nutrition in general?
Yeah, that's a good question. The best piece of advice in regards to nutrition, I think a lot of people overcomplicate nutrition, and I think the simplest advice that I've gotten was actually from Dr. Matthew Nagar, who I had a chat with only a couple of months ago. And he essentially said the idea behind optimal nutrition is that we eat as much of the foods that promote health as possible and as little of the foods that have a negative impact on health as possible. So within the healthier foods, you've got whole grains, fruits, nuts, vegetables, seeds, legumes and beans. And then I guess you can also branch out into the less healthier foods, being like your processed foods, some refined animal products. But I think when it comes to nutrition, and I'm branching out into nutrition right now, but when it does come to nutrition, the ultimate question is compared to what? So when it comes to a whole food plant-based diet, which I'm sure you've spoken about many times throughout your podcast, but when we look at the scientific method, we can only look at correlation. So it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to actually conduct a randomized controlled trial for nutrition, because there's so many different aspects to look at. You can look at, I guess, longevity and all these different ways of, I guess, optimizing health and longevity. But you need to account for alcohol intake, smoking, and all these things. But what we can do is we can get huge amounts of population, track them over time, see what they eat, and see what their health outcomes are in the future. And so what we've done, and there's a huge amount of evidence suggesting that the more whole foods that you incorporate into your diet, the better your health outcomes will be, both in the short term and the long term. So the simplest advice is eat as many whole foods as you can and minimize the rest as much as possible.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's so funny that you bring that up in terms of like there's so many variables. I was actually reading a study this morning from NCBI that was looking at the differences between protein sources and they kind of, you always hear about these 7-day Adventists. And in this quote, and I'll quote it because I've got it in front of me anyway. The 7-day Adventist populations have a very high or very low blood pressure, were found to also be non-smokers, consume less alcohol, have a lower body weight, be more physically active, and consume a general healthier diet. So how can you really specify like diet? And that's why diet is such a hard thing to say, this is right or this is wrong. It's like if you had a whole foods plant-based diet, but you actually didn't move and you smoked and you drank, what would the effects be? And then like you have to compare that to randomize someone who does it and doesn't. It's like there's so many variables. It's almost frustrating, but it also is a awakening that you can't look at diet. You have to look at the big picture and get rid of the DIET and start putting in the word lifestyle.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. It encompasses the whole spectrum of health. The more whole foods you eat, the more you move, the better you sleep, how connected you are to other people as well as yourself, because so much of our brain is dedicated to social integration and connection and cohesion. And so that plays a huge part in our overall health. So we really do have to look at the entire lifestyle. But just on those taking out smoking and all these things, what we have discovered through the blue zones, thanks to Dan Buettner, who's done extensive research and journaling all throughout the world, he's found the 5 places that have the longest living and most nourished people in the world. And a lot of those people are religious, but that helps because that takes out smoking and alcohol. Because when you take those out, then you can actually kind of level out the playing field and compare different types of diets. And all these different types of diets, so we look at Loma Linda in California, then you've got in Costa Rica, or you've got in Japan. You've got slightly different types of diets. Some have more of the oily type foods like nuts and seeds and extra virgin olive oil, where some are more focused on the vegetables and fruits and those kind of things. But the trend is that most of these are living very healthy lifestyles. They're moving a lot. They're engaged in really important work that they consider that it's important, so they feel that they're giving back to the community. And their diet is 80 to 100% whole plant foods. So that's probably the closest we can get in terms of an exact diet that promotes health and longevity. But again, there's so many things that need to be cancelled out. But essentially, as long as you are moving, sleeping well, eating whole, nourishing foods, then you should be pretty sweet.
Should be pretty sweet. Let's switch gears to something that we were talking about earlier and something that hasn't been talked about in the pod. So what would you describe plant medicines are to someone who hasn't heard of them yet?
Totally. Yeah. I guess plant medicines, if we're talking about psychedelics in particular, plant medicines are, I guess, portals in which a experience can happen. When I say that, when I think plant medicines, I think of psychedelic. So let's actually break down that word to begin with. So psychedelic actually comes from a Latin or Greek word, psyche being the mind, and delix comes from the word delos, which means to make clear or visible. So they're mind making visible, which kind of brings me to what they actually do. So plant medicines, they give you a window into your internal dialogue. And so by virtue of pharmacology, but that's the science of drug action, they attach to serotonergic 2A receptors, which are in the brain. And again, the brain and the mind and the soul, it's hard to kind of connect them all into one overriding theory. But essentially what's happening is plant medicines are dissolving the sense of self. And so when we're talking about the level of the brain, there's this region in the brain called the default mode network. And so the default mode network is a lot of midline structures of the brain. But essentially what that part of the brain is doing, or when that brain lights up, is basically when you're not doing anything. You're not involved in any particular task. You're not running. You're not writing. You're not recording a podcast. You're just kind of being. And so this default state is where the bulk of rumination takes place, consolidation of information, what we call the autobiographical self, theory of mind, what we think of ourselves, what we think of other people. And so it's a really important part, and it's very helpful, but that's also where excessive rumination can take place too. So when we're thinking about depression or anxiety or any mental illness, I guess in terms of mental illness, you've got two sides of the spectrum. You've got neuroticism and psychotic, or neurotic and psychotic. And so the way we fit kind of a mental illness into that, let's say PTSD, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, it kind of sits in the middle, because the neuroticism is more the rumination, where you are, I guess, talking to yourself, making sense of reality. And the psychosis is more to do with like something that's so far away from reality. If you think of anxiety, it's more towards the neurotic end of the spectrum, because it's in relation to what's happening, but it's excessive. Whereas psychosis is so distant from reality. So I guess with post-traumatic stress disorder, it leads me to talk about memory and how memory is actually formed. So when we form a memory, there's generally two sides of it, or two compartments. You've got the emotional memory, but also the physical memory, or the factual, or what happened.
Yep.
So when we lay down memories, we have the physical memory of what happened, but then the emotional memory as well. And so when we're recalling a traumatic event, it is itself very painful, because when you're recalling that memory, you get all of this emotional flooding. And so I've kind of digressed a little bit here, but
That's okay.
in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, it's really interesting with the effectiveness of MDMA being used for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. The reason being is because, again, when we talk about the level of brain, there's a blood redistribution away from the amygdala and hippocampus. So the amygdala's involved in the fear, and hippocampus is kind of how we store memory. So that's how we kind of store the emotional memory. And so if you're recalling that trauma, it is very painful. But if you have MDMA and a guide guiding through this, because this is not something that you just take on the street, or this is something that is like a 3-month psychotherapy course with 2 to 3 medicinal doses of MDMA. And so there's a blood redistribution away from the amygdala and away from the hippocampus. So then when you're recalling that trauma, you don't have that emotional flooding. So you can actually replant that memory without the emotional trigger, which is awesome. But back to the default mode network, and this is more in relation to classical psychedelics when we're talking about magic mushrooms, LSD, DMT, these kind of things. The default mode network, as I was saying before, is like this autobiographical self, what we think of ourselves, the narrative that we think of ourselves. And so when we think of the self, or when we think of the ego, it's often confused with narcissism or like overconfidence. When you say, oh, someone has a high ego. We all have egos. We all have this sense of self. And this default mode network is essentially integrating everything that I'm seeing and thinking and hearing, and I'm putting myself in the position where it's the self that's doing the perceiving. But we need to understand that this sense of self is itself a perception. It's the same mechanisms that allow us to perceive the world that actually create the sense of self in the first place. And so by having these plant medicines, you get a blood redistribution away from this default mode network. And so you get a dilution of this sense of self. And this is dose dependent. But essentially what is happening is that you're getting this dissolved sense of self, because a lot of the problems that we face are to do with ourself. Like, oh, I'm not worthy, I'm not this, or I'm feeling this. We're very identified with our thoughts. But when we take away this sense of self as though that it's me that's doing the perceiving, the duality disappears. So right now, you are the object of my consciousness, but I'm the subject of my consciousness. And so non-dual consciousness is not a new thing. It's mentioned in Christianity through the Holy Bible. It's mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita. And a lot of different religions talk about non-dual consciousness. But essentially, you're dissolving the boundaries between yourself and the rest of the world, or the rest of existence. And so what happens is you get this sense of oneness, of unity with everything. And what we need to realize is that we are not the thoughts that arise. We merely are aware of the thoughts that arise. And by disidentifying with those thoughts, kind of gives you a new paradigm into your way of thinking. And so when these thoughts do arise, if anyone's done meditation, they know that all these thoughts are pretty much coming from anywhere and everywhere. But when we think about it, everything that we experience, so right now I'm looking at you, okay? But consciousness is this single condition. And we're always putting ourselves as though it's the self that's doing the perceiving. But really, what I'm actually witnessing now is pretty much a single condition. The only place for things to appear is in consciousness. So you have all these sounds, you have all these sights and feelings, but there's no form. What we need to realize that this self is creating this sense of self, and it makes us feel like we're separate from the rest of the world. And this separation and feeling of loneliness and isolation is often what is causing a lot of the depression and anxiety that we see today. So in my long-winded ramble, I hope this is all making sense. It's just kind of my brain splattering out all this information. But I think it's really, really exciting how things are changing and perspectives are being changed. And what we're seeing now is psychedelic assisted psychotherapy with the work that MAPS are doing over in the States, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Science. They've been doing research since 1986, and they're currently they're predominantly looking at MDMA assisted psychotherapy. Compass Pathways are looking at psilocybin assisted therapy for like depression and anxiety and major depressive disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder and addiction. But essentially what is happening is the FDA have finally recognized that these therapies are extremely effective. They're helping 60 to 80% of people, which is incredible. When you compare that to standard treatments like SSRIs that only fix about 20 to 30% of patients. So we're not saying that these current treatments are ineffective. They just don't work for everyone. And so we're in a mental health crisis at the moment, and we need more treatments available, and especially effective treatments. So coming back to the FDA have actually granted both psilocybin and MDMA breakthrough therapy designation, which essentially means all the approval processes are being fast-tracked. Because at the moment, they are subject to the war on drugs, which back in the Nixon presidency, there was the Controlled Substances Act, which made all psychedelics or all drugs into certain scheduling. So in the FDA in the States, it's a Schedule 1 substance, which means it has high potential for abuse and a lot of dangers to your psychology and physiology, which isn't actually the case. So
is this just MDMA that you're saying is, or all psychedelics?
So all psychedelics were put in the Schedule 1. And so that was in 1970 that the Controlled Substances Act came through. And so there was actually a huge gap in research between 1970 and about 2000, early 2000s. And so there's this huge gap in research because when the war on drugs happened, all of these substances, I mean, the reason why that there was a war on drugs in the first place is because all of these drugs escaped the lab, were being used by the young, and you found all these counterculture movements happening. And so the government basically got a huge fright and said, okay, we need to be able to control these substances. But then there was this overscheduling. And so ever since then, psychedelics haven't been allowed in research up until about 2000. And so even still in Australia with the TGA, we're in Schedule 9, which is the same as the Schedule 1 for FDA over in the States, which makes it very difficult to research. And because of this overscheduling, it hasn't allowed for lots of funding to be coming through for all of this. And so a lot of people are saying, oh, there's not enough research. We need more research. But the answer to there isn't enough research is more research. How can we fully understand the effectiveness of these treatments if we aren't given the funding to research them? So a lot of this funding, like through MAPS.
What's the pushback? Is it just the fact that it's still a Schedule 1? Like who is it exactly that's pushing back, and why are they doing that?
Yeah, it becomes quite a political thing. So I won't get into too much detail there, but essentially there's just a lot of stigma. And so when it comes to drugs, people have this idea of drugs. And the only real reason why psychedelics are called drugs is probably because that they're used in recreational settings. But we really need to desensitize from using the word drug, because when you encompass heroin, caffeine, cannabis, psychedelics, all in the same category, or even paracetamol, it really contains no value. And so we need to move away from the idea that a drug is a bad thing, because when you think about it, breathwork is a drug, going for a run is a drug. They're just altered states of consciousness. And so what we need to do is firstly to realize that psychedelics, despite being categorized as drugs, they're not really a typical drug. Cannabis gives you this comforting haze, cocaine gives you this rush of pleasure, but psychedelics seem to do none of this. They seem to work more in our perception and seem to create kind of paradigm shifting mental patterns.
That's insane. So I was just looking at the actual MAP study because I read it was somewhere like 90%. So I think the study found that they had, so of the 20 participants that took to PTSD specifically from army traumatic events when they were overseas, after doing the PTSD questionnaire 3.5 years later, 89% could no longer be classified as PTSD. So, and that's after 3 sessions.
Yeah. So it's obviously vastly different to the current treatments where you're given, say, an SSRI and you say, okay, you're on this basically for the rest of your life. And what people are led to believe is that you don't have the normal gift of normal brain chemistry, and so this is going to correct that normal brain chemistry and then you'll feel fine. But it's so far from the truth. I mean, mental illness, we all face our own mental difficulty. And so when we categorize ourselves into anxiety or anxious people or depressed people, we tend to reinforce that within us and go, oh, here it comes again. There's the depression because I am a person that is depressed. When that depression or depressed feeling comes in, then we become so identified and it kind of reinforces that. But what we need to move away from is identifying ourselves with that particular mental illness because we all face mental difficulty. It's just when it gets to excessive rumination, like through anxiety and depression, that's when it becomes a problem. But if we're identifying ourselves with this problem, we're also reinforcing that behavior, which isn't always helpful.
I mean, we're looking at, when we're talking about MAPS, from my memory, I think they're Canada-based. Do we have any kind of system here in Australia that does these kind of therapeutic processes where they're taking people with like depression or anxiety or PTSD? Do we have any form of that here?
We have very small trials happening around, but again, like because they're essentially illegal substances, it makes it very difficult to research. So it's usually only very small cases involving only maybe 4 to maybe 10 participants at most, because it's all privately funded. So there is a couple happening. There's a few around Melbourne. I can't remember exactly which universities, but Mind Medicine are currently looking at making an Asia Pacific Centre for emerging mental health therapies. And so what that'll open the doors to is new mental health therapies like that of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And hopefully, if the TGA can recognize these as therapy-based drugs or substances, then it will allow for more research. And when they're recognized as therapy drugs, then all this research will be able to come in. We'll be able to have larger scale studies, and then we'll actually get a better picture of what's actually happening.
That's awesome. And I mean, you mentioned privately funded. That study that I actually just referenced before was a privately funded study, and they're not cheap. They said on there it cost 1.2 mil Canadian dollars, which is very similar to Aussie dollars, but that is an insane amount of money. And I mean, I'm sure you've got like the Tim Ferrisses of the world that kind of fund this kind of stuff.
Yeah, he's the biggest donor to MAPS.
Really?
Yep.
Well, I believe it. He does talk a lot about how it's affected him personally, but I think he also sees the potential and power that it kind of gives people over the long term.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, we're obviously talking about the clinical application of psychedelics, and I think that should be at the forefront of our attention. There are obviously talks around microdosing and optimization, which is always interesting to talk about. But I guess we're in a mental health crisis, and we need, when we're looking at 1 in 5 Australians will face mental difficulty in their lifetime, and suicide is the leading cause of death among young people. So our attention should be looking at the clinical application of medicines and trying to treat this, because at the moment we're only treating or fixing about 20 to 30% of people, which obviously is some, but the vast majority of people are not.
We're helping 20 to 30% only. So 70% go like, we can't help you. That's crazy.
Well, that's when you're looking at all these different treatment options and you're trying all these different types of treatments. But
what's currently like treatment for mental? Is it like we're talking counseling? Like what kind of treatment are we talking about?
It depends on the mental illness, but generally when it comes to depression, you go to your doctor first and they'll say, oh yeah, you've got depression. Here, I'll give you an SSRI.
Pills, yeah.
Take that for the rest of your life. If that doesn't work, we'll up the dose, see how you go. If that doesn't work, we'll up the dose again and see how you go. If that doesn't work, I'll give you to a psychiatrist and they can work with you, or a psychologist or counselor or something like that. And so a lot of it's just one-on-one clinician-patient kind of relationship that you're trying to build and trying to understand where the mental illness is coming from. But yeah, it's quite unjust to see that most treatments aren't working.
I mean, where you mentioned the word microdosing, can you explain firstly what that is, what that looks like, and how, I mean, they're using, I'm not sure if they've done any sort of clinical trials or what the average person is doing with something like that?
Yeah, so I guess when it comes to psychedelics, there's the psycholytic model, the psychedelic model. I guess the psycholytic model is not looking at, a huge trip dose. You're not kind of dissolving this sense of self entirely, but the psycholytic model is looking at the moment, it's really promising with neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's and dementia, because the nature of these substances is that they actually promote neuroplasticity and neurogenesis as well as spinogenesis. And so the psycholytic model is looking at lower doses but typically dosed more often, and you're not trying to change the way you're thinking as such, but you're trying to promote that neuroplastic state. The psychedelic model is, of course, high doses, dosed 2 to 3 times, if we're talking about in relation to a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy course, which is usually about 3 months. And so that's very high doses. Psycholytic is somewhere in between a microdose and a psychedelic dose. So you still definitely feel the substance, but definitely not dissolving or a complete ego dissolution. But then a microdose is something that's usually a 10th to a 20th of a typical quote-unquote trip dose. So it's meant to be subperceptual. But the idea behind it is that you're trying to accommodate this neuroplastic state and promote neurogenesis. And so when it comes to clinical trials, there isn't any clinical trials because firstly, there hasn't even been enough funding for the psychedelic model to come into fruition. And secondly, because we're working with more so optimization, it's very hard to firstly fund something that is using an illegal substance. And secondly, for something that's more of a subjective response to it in terms of more creativity or
productivity, all of that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, microdosing is interesting. And there is you can go on to, I think it's microdose.me. If you are someone that is microdosing, you kind of, I guess most people who are doing it are keeping a journal and seeing how they feel and looking at the likes of, I guess, Tim Ferriss and other people who might be microdosing and kind of get an idea of what difference they do feel. But yeah, essentially it's a subperceptual dose with the idea being you're more productive and you can kind of use that neuroplastic state of the brain to mold new connections more easily. So say you're learning a language or you're trying to learn a new concept or trying to study, it can be helpful. But again, there isn't enough research suggesting that it is going to be perfectly helpful for it. But we're just basing that off the neuroplastic and spinogenesis and neurogenesis properties that psychedelics have.
So you're meaning like when you take a big dose, all forms of reality kind of melt away. From what I understand, these small doses are almost, you don't feel it, and it could be a placebo thing, and that's what I'm curious what the studies will find out. But is this, we're talking like capsule form, like how does that happen?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on the substance that you are going to take. Yeah, I mean, a subperceptual dose would be a 10th of a dose. So in the case of psilocybin or magic mushrooms, 5 grams of dried mushrooms seems to be like the complete center to a different reality. So about a 10th of that. So probably anywhere between like 0.1 to 0.5 grams is what you would do for a microdose for psilocybin. LSD has quite a spectrum of doses. I guess a recreational dose would be somewhere around 100 micrograms. And then if you are doing a deep mystical experience where you get a complete ego death, you're looking at the range of 300 to 400 micrograms and above. So a microdose for LSD would probably be about 10 to 15 micrograms or around there. So I guess you can play with the doses and see how you feel. But again, we're talking about illegal substances here, so we need to be careful what we're saying.
Yeah, we're not condoning any of this, obviously. We're just talking about the research that is going into it. Because I do think it's quite interesting, especially because of the potentials and what's been happening at the moment with PTSD, which I know a huge determiner of suicide rates, especially amongst males. So a lot of these things, you talk about them, you say the words magic mushrooms or even ecstasy, I think is a bit more accepted because people understand that it's a party drug. You go out, you get offered it if you're at a club, that kind of thing. But then we're looking at LSD, something that you don't come by at a party or a club. How do we break the stigma to have these conversations about, hey, this compound or these group of compounds have a large or ever expanding body of research that's actually really looking good for the healing of a lot of different conditions and feelings? How do you break the stigma to have that or allow that conversation to take place?
Through education, like the conversations that we're having now. People really don't understand most drugs. They just see it as kind of this altered state that you feel good or you feel kind of nice. You break down the barriers and you can talk a lot more than you usually would. But I actually had a conversation with Greg Barnes, and he worked alongside Malcolm Turnbull within the referendum in 1999, and he's pro-drugs. In terms of the stigma, I asked him, what happens first? Do we need to break down the stigma and then policy will change? Or do we change policy and then as a result, the stigma will come down? And then he kind of said, well, it's kind of both. And so what we're seeing over in like California, when we've only recently had a huge, not only decriminalization and depenalization, we've also had a legalization of pretty much all drugs. And obviously that in itself will break down the stigma. But to break down the stigma, there needs to be education. We need to be having these conversations. Because throughout school, I guess you or I weren't really taught all that much about drugs. We kind of just say, stay away from drugs because, you'll screw up your brain.
And to be fair, some drugs are absolute holes. And like we're talking like heroin, like those kind of compounds that are not used in the context of what we're talking about in a therapeutic sense.
Right. Well, context, you bring up a very important point because the context by which the drug is administered is the most important thing. Being prescribed morphine by your doctor or taking heroin in the side street corner, they are vastly different situations and completely different, but they're essentially the same thing. They're both opioids and they both kind of have sedative properties. So coined by Albert Hofmann in the early 50s, and he was the one that first synthesized LSD, set and setting are integral in terms of moving away from our current ways of thinking. And so the set is the mindset going into the experience, psychological expectations, how you feel about taking this drug, and the setting being the environment, the clinician-patient relationship. I guess this environment by which we're taking it is the most important aspect of taking a substance. Because if you don't understand how psychedelics work and you hear this conversation, you're like, oh, they seem awesome, I'm going to go take them over here with my friends this weekend. The chance for things to go wrong is very high. But what we've found through research is that within controlled environments, in environments that are supportive with guides that are they're guiding through the experience, you set your intentions for the reason for using the drugs. And having that experience is obviously vastly different to if you were just having it at a party. But also it's the integration of what happens after the experience that is also important. Because like I was talking about memories before, any memory is obviously something that happened in the past, but as it was happening. And so if we are having an experience with the intention of healing ourselves, the integration is almost the most important part, is recalling what your insights were when you took that. So you've got the set and setting, and usually a guided psychedelic experience is over 3 days. So the first day you're kind of preparing yourself for the experience, setting your intentions. Obviously, in terms of psychotherapy, it's over 3 months, and you dosed 2 to 3 times. But if you're just looking at the experience itself over the 3 days, you have the preparation day, day 1, doing a lot of meditation and setting your intentions for the reasons for using the substance. And then you have the day of the experience. And so a lot of times the clinician will have a set or an agreed upon set of music. And so when you're doing the integration phase, you're actually replaying that music. And so when you are having the experience and all these new insights are being formed, because the guide is directing you to this problem in the first place. And then because of the nature of psychedelics, there's this randomness of firing effect, because more of the brain is connected. So I said before, there's a blood redistribution away from the default mode network, but the rest of the brain actually lights up more than it would in normal waking consciousness. So you actually have all these new neurons that are firing and talking to each other across all parts of the brain. And so you're getting new insights, new perceptions, and new understandings of reality. And so that's all well and good, but you need to make sure that next day, the integration, you're replaying that musical playlist that you've done, remembering what insights you were having. But I guess a lot of people find it difficult to describe the experience in terms of language, because language is always going to be a reductionist tool. When I say the word consciousness, the word itself has no meaning. Or when I say God, or when I say Jesus, or when I say awareness or presence, so often we get caught up in ideas and concepts and words, but the words themselves are the pointers. So if you imagine the word is the finger that's pointing, so often we're caught about that word itself, God. It's like, oh, you think of this figure and you've got this perception of the word God. But if you look at the Holy Bible and you look at the Bhagavad Gita, it's based on a story. And so the story is not the entire truth. The story is the one that's pointing to the truth. And I'm not saying there's truth in all aspects of religion, but essentially if you're looking at all these religious texts, they're all pointing to essentially the same thing. And we get so caught up in the words and ideas, but we lose sense of what they're actually meaning. And so we need to focus less on the finger that's pointing, but what the finger points to.
I love that. That's such a deep dive. And we've been talking about psychedelics for a while. And obviously I'll just finish up this section and we'll move on to, like what you were saying before, I don't recommend psychedelics by any means. I can't imagine you would, because like I said, especially unless you're doing it with a guide, they can be extremely dangerous, especially if you get sucked into the holes. And there's definitely a lot of reasons not to take them, probably more so than there are two. So
yes and no. Like with mind medicine, my primary focus is obviously the clinical application of psychedelics, but I do think there is a place for recreation. I'm hoping that eventually Australia and Western countries and all over the world will legalize all drugs, because you should be in control of your own consciousness. If you want an altered state, you should be allowed to reach an altered state. And the war on drugs hasn't worked. There's still huge amounts of drug intake. But because it's unregulated, you never really know what you're getting. And so if you have a legalized system that is regulating drugs, so you know what you're getting, you're using them in a licensed setting. Like you go to a bar, it's a licensed setting for alcohol. The barman knows that if you see such and such is intoxicated, not to serve them anymore. And then if you have licensed setting of, say, cannabis, where, you know what you're getting, you have the people there available to you if you're having a difficult experience. And we have difficult experiences when we're drunk or under the consumption of alcohol. And same thing with psychedelics. If they were used in licensed setting, firstly, people would have to be educated on the substance in the first place before they're actually taking it. So, of course, we're not recommending anyone to just go out and take any drug. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm saying people need to be aware of what the drugs are doing and not just place it as this crazy drug experience. Because all drugs, well, not all drugs, I won't say all drugs, but many drugs can actually give you profound insights into your own idea of reality. And what's interesting is that we have all these altered states of awareness when we're asleep. Like, what's happening when we're asleep? Like, what does that even mean? And then you have altered states if you do this breath work, or you have altered states pretty much as you go task to task to task doing things. You're in altered states of awareness. And then same thing with a drug. It's an altered state of awareness. But what's common amongst all of these altered states is that you are aware of them. So the common trend among all of these altered states, everything's taking new form, but the common theme is that you are aware of it. And so what altered states can teach us is that you are not the body that makes up this person. The brain is the medium by which consciousness can occur, but we don't know if brain produces consciousness. We don't know. We know very little about the brain, and we know very little about consciousness. So it's quite reductionist to suggest that the brain and consciousness are even connected. But what we do know is that through altered states, the brain can take new form and different parts of the brain light up. But we don't know, we know that if we're thinking in theory of mind and rumination, we know that the default mode network is lighting up. And then we know if we take psychedelics, there's a blood redistribution away from that, so there's less activity in the default mode network. But again, like I said at the very start, we need to kind of disassociate body, mind, and brain, because they're all this intertwined kind of entity. But essentially what we are is just awareness of it.
Silence to let that sink in. No, I love all that. And then switching gears, look, for those on video, we can see your bulging forearms here. Under there, we've probably got some insane biceps. What's your philosophy on working out and I guess looking after your body really well in terms of movement for longevity and vitality?
In terms of movement, I really like training in the gym because it allows me to connect to all parts of my body. So I see it as this meditative practice of like a body scan. Say if I'm working my chest, then I'm really connecting, getting those neural connections to my chest and really being aware of it. But in terms of the longevity aspect, it doesn't really matter what exercise you do as long as you are moving. And in terms of that longevity aspect, it's very actually quite similar to fasting, because we know theories have been made that fasting is similar to very high intensity activity exercise because of the level of energy that's being diminished. And so when we have really low energy levels, when I say energy, I mean in the form of ATP or adenosine triphosphate, which is, I guess, the energy currency that our body uses. And so all the animals and plants use as well. And so when we have low amounts of, I guess, available energy, then there's a lot of longevity pathways on a biological level that strengthen our DNA, that are helpful in autophagy. Autophagy is like the cell clean out process. And so it's really important to kind of pulse this, because I guess from an evolutionary lens, humans have kind of had a period of eating and then a period of fasting, period of eating and a period of fasting. And during that fasting period, it's generally like running around looking for food. So the idea behind fasting is it makes sense. But I guess your question was in terms of exercise and performance. We want to, I guess, activate these longevity pathways. So we want to activate autophagy. And autophagy only happens if we have used up amino acids and protein to build, whether it's new muscles or new cells. I mean, cells are recreating themselves all the time. But I'm not sure if you're familiar with lifespan. What's it?
It's not Matthew Walker, it's David Sinclair.
David Sinclair. Yeah, he talks about...
I was about to mention lifespan because you're talking about autophagy. I'm like, you're referring to Sirtuin cells and their role in the original one. What's the original bloody one cell that like only had to turn off? Yeah. Turn on and turn off. I forgot what it's called anyway.
But yeah, let's talk about sirtuins. Sirtuins, by the name, the SIR is silent information regulator. And so a lot of things to do with longevity is in relation to these sirtuins. Essentially, like you've got the epigenome and the genome. So the genome is the physical structure. So you've got the DNA helix. But for a gene to turn on, it needs to be activated. And so these sirtuins sit on particular genes, so they're silencing a particular gene. And so when certain sirtuins are activated, they wake up certain genes. So if it is something to do with autophagy and recycling these old proteins and often damaged proteins with new ones and kind of clean out the cell, the risk of the DNA actually being damaged goes way down. And yeah, I guess that's kind of the idea.
Well, my next question is completely unrelated to what we were just talking about. We both read Lifespan, but I wouldn't for the life of me be able to remember that. How do you soak in information? Like you obviously remember quite a lot, especially when we're talking. I mean, I'm sure you're not a neuroscientist and I'm sure their knowledge is a lot more expansive, but you clearly know a lot for someone who hasn't studied that in a formal setting. How do you work on remembering these insanely detailed information pieces? How do you do that?
I guess it's repetition. It's just, if you have somewhat of a system, say you're reading it for the first time and you're not making sense of it, and you go through the chapter or whatever it is you're reading or learning, I guess you have to have ways of integrating that information, because the only way a memory is going to be formed is if you re-access a memory. And like I spoke about PTSD before, if you have a traumatic event and then recall the trauma, you're actually solidifying that neural network. So anytime when it comes to learning it, it is, I guess, repetition or understanding it in your own way. Some people are auditory learners, some people are visual learners. So it depends which medium of learning you like the most or vibe with the most. So for me, I've always been interested in the podcast. That's the reason why I got into podcasts in the first place, is that. So I studied an exercise and sports science degree and majored in nutrition and exercise physiology. And that was all well and good and awesome. But then there was this period of after I studied where I kind of missed learning. And then that's how I got into podcasts and started listening to podcasts and found that I really resonated with that kind of slow and semi-structured conversation and people actually going into depth of the topic. So I guess you just kind of need to find how you operate best. So if I was trying to learn a new concept, probably the first thing I would do is listen to it if there was some kind of auditory way of doing it. So say
plug for Audible. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is our new show sponsor, guys.
That wouldn't be too bad, actually. Yeah, so I remember David Sinclair, I listened to him first on a couple of different podcasts, and then I listened to his book, and then I just kind of skimmed through the hard copy of his book. And then often after I've had like a bout of learning a new concept, you need that space. So if you go straight on to the next task, it's very difficult to integrate what you've just done. So often I might go for a walk or just lie in my bed or do something like that you're not necessarily doing anything, but your brain kind of just automatically sorts out. And by you just thinking about the concept, you're actually promoting that neural network that you've just learned, I suppose.
Awesome. I love that. So obviously you're fasting for health, and I know you personally, so I know you eat for health. What does eating for health mean, or what does that look like for you?
As in what I eat?
Yeah. Give me the juice.
Yeah, I mean, I do fast pretty much every day. And that obviously doesn't mean a 24-hour fast every day, but usually if I was looking at a week, I would fast one day of the week. And usually I'd try and time it around my training. But like I was saying before, we want low energy availability because that's when those longevity pathways are being activated. So the way I kind of do it is I usually have an eating window of somewhere between 2 and 5 p.m. So I have a very small eating window. And usually I would time it so that obviously in the morning I'm not eating all the way up till I've done a couple of bouts of exercise. So my morning routine is that I go for a walk with little Pepper, my little puppy, Australian. Oh, she's not a puppy. She's almost 4 now. She's actually 4 next week. But I go for a walk with her, and then I'll kind of do my deep work. I mean, I have a lot of like morning routine structure, and we can go over that. But I'd go for a walk, and then I'd have like my cardio-based exercise. Generally, before I do my gym-based stuff or resistance
Is that
training.
like that for a reason?
It is, because I would time it so that immediately after I go to the gym, I'm starting my eating window, because you want to activate protein synthesis and muscle protein.
What about before you work out? Like, is there a reason that you do cardio first before actually putting like resistance training on your schedule?
It's more so because I want to eat after a training session and
not the cardio.
Not the cardio.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, you need to have some degree of protein synthesis after a cardio session, but it's certainly not comparable to a resistance training session where you're actually tearing microfibers, and you need that. You need an immune response, and then you need those available proteins and carbohydrates and fats to rebuild that. So yeah, I would usually do a cardio session in the morning, and then after my cardio session is usually a cold shower. I'm a sucker for cold showers. And then continue deep work. And then I would, as soon as I start kind of get feeling a little bit hungry, is usually when it's probably either time to kind of, well, the way I kind of time it is because caffeine is an appetite suppressant. I usually time the caffeine when I'm just a little bit hungry, and then I have the caffeine before a certain exercise bout.
When you say caffeine, this is like an espresso shot or a long black, no milk.
No milk, obviously.
No,
I mean,
like,
you could have
when I say
soy
milk, I say like soy or
yeah,
oat.
right. Well, yeah. I mean, any kind of caffeine is going to be helpful. I mean, caffeine's actually interesting because it's one of the only substances that actually promotes fat oxidation. And so whenever you see like fat burner, you have
like
all
green
these
tea.
funky different ingredients. But yeah, green tea is one of them. So you got like theanine and caffeine's a good combination. But you also need to make sure that you're not having it too close to sleep either. Because caffeine itself has a half-life of
9
6
hours.
to 8 hours. Yeah, somewhere
Yeah,
depending on.
it's like 9 hours, and then again at 14. I think a lot of it's broken down by about 17 hours. So it doesn't fully break down until the next day.
No. But that's also one of the reasons why it's an appetite suppressant is because when you have this lower amounts available ATP, the caffeine is actually an inhibitor of a particular enzyme that is to do with lower amounts of ATP. I can't remember the exact enzyme or receptor off the top of my head. But essentially it's because lower ATP is a signal that you have a low energy state. But if you have the caffeine, it actually competes for that, and then you have reduced level or reduced perception of energy. So you have increased perception of energy, but it's taken away from the actual low level of ATP. So it feels like you have more energy than you do. So I usually time that before my gym session, usually around 10 a.m. And then, I'll be in bed by like 9 p.m. So usually I'm pretty sweet by then.
Do you know some people, this is what I learned from Huberman. I'm not sure if you've listened to any of his stuff.
Yeah, he's
or
awesome.
Huberman.
Yeah.
He said some people, like I'm super sensitive to caffeine. And if I have a coffee, even if it's a single shot, after 11 a.m., I will not sleep till about 2 a.m. I will not. And so when I go out, I don't need a drink. I just have a coffee at like 5 p.m. I'm good. And some people actually have a mutated receptor gene to which the caffeine doesn't affect them or affects them a super tiny amount to which they can have a coffee at 9 p.m. and go to bed at 10 and be fine. And other people like me can't have coffee after like 10 or 11 and not sleep. How fascinating is that?
It is fascinating. And if you read Why We Sleep by
Yeah.
Matthew Walker? Yeah,
Matthew
so
Walker.
he talks about sleep pressures. And so one of the sleep pressures is lower amounts of energy. And so for some people, the sleep pressures are slightly different in terms of what actually makes us fall asleep, but they're all in the same kind of category of sleep pressure. But if you have higher perceived energy, even though you have lower amounts of energy, you have less sleep pressure, so that it's harder for you to fall asleep. So that's probably where that's coming from.
That's awesome. So talk to me about your morning routine that you mentioned before. You've constructed something, you construed something from all the books you've read, the podcasts you listen to. What is the schedule that you've created for yourself?
It changes day to day, but I generally have a habit tracker that it's usually a health habit tracker. So I just track.
Is this like from Atomic Habits? Is this another book that you've read?
I use that habit tracker for more project based stuff. Just things like, I don't know, working on mind body plants or working on mind medicine or biolab or different projects that I'm working on. But I've kind of collated this health habit tracker that is more focused around health, obviously. So that's where I track my sleep. So I'll just have like when I went to bed, what time I woke up.
Doesn't your watch do that for you?
It does, but it's nice to have it on. I like writing.
Okay.
I have the thing about using a pen and writing things down.
So do you on the note of sleep, do you use the Garmin to track your sleep and do you check those stats?
I actually don't, no.
No?
It's more of just my subjective idea of what kind of sleep quality I have. It's not the most extensive sleep tracker I have, but it's kind of just looking at like, when did I go to bed? When did I wake up? I also measure my caffeine intake when I had that. And so kind of take it all into account and figure out when the best way of sleep and wake is for me.
Mm-hmm.
And at the moment it's somewhere around 9 p.m. I go to bed, then I wake up anywhere between 4:30 and 5:30. I have an alarm at 5:30, but I usually wake up before then.
I can't believe you get up that early.
Neither can I, really.
You naturally get up?
Naturally get up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
I do have, in my room, I always have my blinds up when I go to sleep.
Right, so you wake up with the sun.
Wake up with the sun, but usually I've been waking up a lot before the sun.
It's pretty nice to be up that early.
It is.
Like it's just so peaceful.
Exactly the reason why it's perfect for my morning schedule. So yeah, when I do wake up, my health habit tracker will just say like early wake. So I'll just tick off early rise. It used to be called just up before 6, but now it's just early rise because it's more of a guideline than a set thing. And then the first thing I'll do is hydrate myself as much as possible. So probably have a few glasses of water, and have tea.
What kind of
Have
tea?
tea first thing. Oh, it's a combination. I can't remember what brand it is, but there's green tea. There's I think peppermint in there. It's a concoction of about like 10 different things, but it's also got like ginkgo and ginseng and those kind of things.
Yeah,
so it's kind of a nice
like a herbal concoction. Yeah,
concoction, exactly that. So I'll have that, which I had made the night before. It's in the fridge. It's nice and refreshing in the morning. And then I'll read. So usually I'll read a spiritual-based book. So at the moment I'm reading A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle, which is awesome, and I recommend that to anyone. I'm always finish that. So it's usually a spiritual-based book to kind of get me in that kind of mindset, because after I do about 30 minutes of reading, I will journal. So gratitude, compassion, affirmations, those kind of things, just really planting the seed into my subconscious of like, I am love, or I am compassionate. I will bring total compassion to my day and those kind of things. And then straight after that will be breath work. So at the moment I'm doing the Wim Hof method, which it's like breathe in, breathe out. And it's more of a letting go. So
Use the app?
Deep breath. I don't use the app. No, there's a thing on Spotify that I've used.
It's on Spotify?
No,
it's on YouTube.
There's one on YouTube. This one that I've downloaded on Spotify it's a 3-round one.
Yeah.
But I either do 3 rounds or 5 rounds of Wim Hof method. And there's awesome science to back that up as well, which I don't know extensively, but I know it's awesome
from my research.
community.
I looked at it because I knew the Wim Hof method was very new. So essentially what they did was actually based in Tokyo, because that's where, what's that Japanese word where you die from overworking?
No idea.
So Japan have this, they've literally created a word because it's in their culture, and to bring pride to your family, you work so much. So there's cases in Tokyo that's quite common where you just die on your desk. I'll Google it later and I'll mention it. But essentially, so they went to Japan, to Tokyo in particular, to conduct these studies to see if we could lower their blood pressure. Because what happens was their blood pressure was just so elevated that they had these heart attacks at like 40. So it was just crazy. So what they did was it was a 2-part, because the first time they did it, they set aside, it was 7 people per group. And so one group had breathe in, breathe out. Second group had breathe in, hold, breathe out. And the third group, nothing. Right. And so they tracked their blood pressure. And what they found was there was a slight betterment in the people who just went and like weren't counting. The second group actually had quite stable to the people who weren't doing nothing, because they, in their mind, they're like, okay, I got to go 7 rounds. And they just had that like 7 rounds, and they were too occupied with the what they were doing. So the next time they conducted the study, they actually had it just breathe in and actually quite natural. And they said, just do it as you, and I might be butchering a little bit of the scientific method here, but do it as you would normally. They kind of taught them how to do it. And they found that had a huge decrease. Their blood pressure went down like 20%. Like it was huge compared to the people who were doing nothing. And it went down lower than the study before, where they were quite meticulous with how many seconds they were breathing in, how many seconds they were holding, how many rounds. So the studies is just based on the lowering of blood pressure, and that's what they've found with the breathing.
But essentially, you're just trying to change the chemistry. So you're trying to oxygenate your blood as much as possible. And in that, you get endorphins released, so you feel it's quite pleasurable, especially towards the end. You kind of feel, I wouldn't say lightheaded, but you just kind of feel kind of spacey, and it feels quite nice. So yeah, I'll either do 3 or 5 rounds of breath work in the morning, and then immediately after that I'll start my meditation, because I find that breath work is an awesome way to get into a meditative practice. And I find that when you're in that space of just kind of, you've got those endorphins released and you're kind of just feeling good, I find that that's a really good place to start a meditation. So then usually I'll only meditate for about 10 or so minutes.
What kind of meditation are you doing?
It changes between 2. One is just, it's kind of, I forgot what it's like brainwaves. So you plug in brainwaves and it gives you like,
So like 346 hertz or something like that.
I don't know what all that is about, but I'd read Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, because Joe Dispenza talks about the different wavelengths in your brain. But it's kind of just like this buzzing sound. And so I guess all my meditations are pretty similar in that all the objects of my awareness, whether that be thoughts, whether that be feelings, I'm trying to focus on the space between the subject and object. So I try to notice the thoughts, and I try and put myself in the position where it's like, I am it. Like, change or break down the boundaries between yourself and your perception of reality. Because like I was mentioning earlier about the self, it's like we're always putting ourselves in the position where it's the self that's doing the perceiving. But me staring out into the window right now, yes, I am looking out into the window, so it seems like there's the duality, but I am aware of my body just as much as I'm aware of that which pervades my body. Whatever I perceive is myself. So you break down those boundaries. So I guess through the brainwaves is that I'm listening and kind of putting myself in the position where it's like, I am that. That is the experience. Because consciousness is a single condition in which things just appear and disappear. And so you have certain symphony or harmony of different appearances and disappearances in consciousness, and we call those perceptions. And then my other type of meditation is just without the sound and just more focusing on the body or thoughts or, again, but yeah, just focusing on that space between what it is I'm perceiving and the subject, which is, I guess, my body. So I'm that space between what I'm perceiving and kind of putting myself in the position where I am that experience. So that's my meditation practice, which is, usually only like 10 or 15 minutes or so. But that depends on how quickly I can get into that kind of meditative state. And while we're on the subject of meditation, this is actually how I figured out about the similarity between psychedelics and meditation, because we were talking about the default mode network earlier. There's been some really, really cool insights in brain imaging, especially over the past 10 to 15 years, and in particular at Imperial College London, with the work of the likes of Robin Carhart-Harris and David Nutt. They're looking at the neuroimaging side of things. So they've actually looked at long-term meditators, those that have done 10,000 hours plus of meditation. And then they look at the psychedelic experience and look at the brain imaging and compare the two. And so what we find that's similar about these two experiences is that there is the muting of the default mode network. And it's interesting, if you ever have heard of Ram Dass's story and how he went to India and found his guru, and then he gave his guru
did not have a response.
1,200 micrograms of LSD, and to put that into context is like 3 or 4 times more than you would need for a deep mystical experience.
Yeah, you'd have a full ego dissolution. You'd probably forget who you are.
And he took it and he's like, nothing. And so he kept giving him more and more and more. It was like, nothing. But yeah, in terms of brain imaging, what we can say in terms of brain imaging, and the default mode network is the seat of the self or the seat of the ego, as far as we can say that in terms of brain imaging. Again, we can't always have that direct correlation, but what we do know is that certain parts of the brain light up or mute in particular altered states. So meditation is essentially moving away from this sense of self, because like I was saying before, you want to have it as this single condition or this just presence, and not identifying with anything that you're doing, because you are just the awareness of it, and you're putting yourself in the position where it's trying to be aware of awareness. It's like, where is that coming from? How am I perceiving this? Where is that coming from? And really taking the back seat and just allowing things to be, and you to be that. It's not that the subject and object is that you are this experience, not that you are having this experience. You are this. And referring to something that Jesus said through the Holy Bible, it says, the only truth is that you are the truth. You are it. And in terms of Buddhist traditions, it's like becoming one with consciousness or one with God. Again, ideas and concepts, they're only pointing. And so becoming one with God is that you are ultimately the absolute truth. The only truth is that you're aware of this. Everything else is a relative truth. We talk about science and all this world stuff and walls and tables and social connection.
Forget about plants,
and all these things.
Beautiful plants we've got in front of us.
And fungi.
Yeah, fungi.
It's also pretty important. But again, they're relative truths, because we can only talk about them in relation to other things about them. So, and I mean, the whole concept of time as well is so fascinating. It's because time's a human thing. We've built up this idea of time, and always to get people into the mind framework, I say, well, how long did it take you to be aware of yourself? And you kind of think like, how long did it take me till I knew I was human? Well, the answer is both eternal and instant, because time isn't a thing. Time is this human thing, and we base it on these relative truths. It's like,
I mean, time kind of is a thing, right? Because we age. So you've got time
but
as
that's
in
the relative, isn't it?
Yeah, but the moon still, the Earth still cycles around the sun. That doesn't happen instantly. It happens over different cycles of the moon. Like, you know what I mean? Like your body ages. You're not born and then you're an adult. Time, as time as we've created in hours that fit, like we've created hours. So we work from 9 to 5. And so it works with this, capitalistic system or society that we've created, but it's still, there has to be some sort of concept of time because we age. And for us to understand the concept of aging, we have to create this concept of time. So in a way, it does exist. We've created something to help us understand what it is, but time itself is actual. But it's also relative because I know in different planets, it's different cycles of time, but although it's relative, it definitely exists.
So we think. The perception is that it exists, definitely. But yeah, the whole concept of like we're moving around the sun, and I guess where time comes from is the speed at which light is moving. So because, you've got the reflection of the atom or whatever the molecule is, and that reflects onto you. And so the reason why we have time is because it's the distance the light has traveled. And so the observable universe is kind of like expanded time, I guess, because as far as we can look out into the observable universe, there's a point where it just stops because light's only getting out that way. And so in terms of like astronomy or astrophysics, I guess Neil deGrasse Tyson would be able to explain this a lot better than I am, but if you move at the speed of light, no time passes, relatively. And so if you exist faster than light, something like a tachyon, for example, you're actually going back in time. And so, but yeah, the concept of time is because humans store memory, and because like we're having this experience right now, and this is the nowness. But when we think about this tomorrow, we're essentially going back in time, but we're thinking about it in the present because we've got this brain that stores information, and we know that the sun's going around this and this and this. But again, it's relative to our perception of it because, of course, it works better that way. But I think, the whole concept of time is a bit of a mind bender.
So Neil, I know you're listening to this, mate. Just come on and help explain what's going on here. So that's your morning routine, huh?
Yeah, well, but it's more just to get me in that mindset of, because I would say time is the relative truth, and we can speak in terms of relative truth. We can say a whole food plant pace, relatively speaking, is the most health nourishing way to live, relatively speaking. But yeah, when I think of like how long did it take before I was aware of this, both eternal and instant, and the whole concept of infinite time, people think it's just like a really, 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 really long time, but it's more no time. It's unfolding. It's just this unfoldingness that we have the perception of time because, the unfoldingness is that, that position versus that position, and then that relative to that is the time. But again, that's because humans have been able to develop this brain that can store memories and information, and so we're basing that of things that are happening. But everything always happens now, and the eternal now is what you want to get into that space when you're meditating, I suppose.
Awesome. I love all that. I love it. Look, coming towards the end of the pod, before we look into where we can connect with you, amongst all the topics, and they range far and wide, we talked about today, is there any parting words that you'd like to leave us with that can be but doesn't have to be related to our conversation?
One thing that I've been really working on is, I guess, deprogramming my mind in terms of when we talk about love, and a lot of people and almost everyone, when we grow up and we have our environment and we're hopefully loved by our parents, but we're always experiencing ourselves. And so when I'm hanging out with you right now and having a chat, okay, I'm in this certain state of my consciousness, but essentially I'm still experiencing myself. And coming to love, a lot of us think it's to be loved, but to be loved is it's the condition when we're with someone that is said to love us, and so then we activate our own love within us. But it's not to be loved, it is to love. It is our nature that we have this love inside of us and compassion inside of us. And so what we see is that because we're conditioned to think that we need love externally and we can't activate it for ourselves, we have this conditioning that it's to be loved and not to love. But Joe Dispenza talks about this a lot more eloquently than I do. But when you really pay attention to that feeling of love and compassion that you feel when you're with someone that you love, you can activate that through a meditative practice. If you know how you're feeling and really understand it in its totality, through a meditative practice, you can access that. You don't need that external parent or loved one to access that feeling of love. It is our nature to love. Our conditioning is so that we need to hang out with our dog or with our parent or with a loved one to feel it, but you can activate that without it. So that's what I've been playing on my mind recently, so I thought I'd chuck that in at the end.
I love that. I think a really good read, if someone's interested in that topic, is Mastery of Love by Don Miguel Ruiz, or Don Jose Ruiz, his son. I'm not sure which one of it is. But it's a great read, and I love that. To finish up, where can we connect with you?
Probably the best way is through Instagram. So it's at mindbody_plants. So it's currently in the reform process. I'm not sure when this will
come out in like May or April. So hopefully
by then it will be all ready to go and have all the contact stuff there. But yeah, all my stuff's there's a links to all the descriptions and things like that, and how to email me through there. Otherwise it's contact@mindbodyplants.co. You can email me that way. But yeah, I think the Instagram will have all the links there available.
Awesome. Look, I'd just like to say on behalf of myself and the Plant Paradigm community, thank you for being such an amazing soul and for giving us your time and this beautiful space, volunteering this space for us to come and record this podcast in person. Look, it's been an absolute pleasure to know you as a human being, and thank you for all the effort that you put in educating us through your Mind Body Plants podcast, but also through Mind Medicine. I know you guys are doing amazing work, and the potential there is absolutely huge to help not one person, not two, but potentially hundreds, if not thousands of individuals through education and through mass reform. So I really appreciate all the work you do there. I think it's absolutely phenomenal. So thank you so much, Tommy. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, man. It's been awesome to have an in-person chat. It's funny because I've realized I've rambled on about so many different things and trying to think of things instead of asking the questions. I found it actually more difficult being interviewed than the interviewer, because like if I get an idea and go, oh yeah, I'll just ask him that. But being the interviewer is like, oh, I have to come up with that answer. It's been interesting, but I've certainly enjoyed it, and I really appreciate you asking me to come on and speak about psychedelics, because I think that's something that will pave the way for mental illness in the future. So thank you, and the Plant Paradigm community.
Let's do it, bro. Oh, I hope you guys heard that clamp. Peace. Hi there. Welcome to the end of the episode. I really appreciate your time in listening the whole way through. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please help us out by leaving a review on Apple iTunes and also sharing it with friends, family, and colleagues. Thank you, Tommy, for coming on and sharing this amazing conversation. You are truly an inspiring soul. If you wanted to connect with him, I've left all the links in the show notes below. And of course, you can always follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and all the other socials. But that is it from me today. I will see you guys on next week's conversation. Until then, stay happy, eat plants, peace.